For most people, there are two major guiding forces that motivate just about everything we do: pleasure and pain. We usually try to experience the most pleasure possible while suffering the least amount of pain. The behaviors we choose can be thought of as a balance between the pleasure and pain that we associate with those behaviors. That's why we'd probably prefer to take a vacation than work a double shift. We associate a lot more pleasure with a sandy beach than we do with working too many hours on the job.
Our constant pursuit of pleasure and our desire to avoid pain causes some of us to turn to alcohol. And depending on how much better this mood-altering drug makes us feel, there's a possibility that we could become alcohol dependent. But how does this happen? Initially, at a low dose, alcohol produces a pleasurable effect. In addition, it causes a loss of inhibitions, which is why it can inspire people to storm the dance floor and wiggle their way out of control. However, at higher doses, alcohol can result in a lot of pain.
Knowing this to be true, what leads people to drink heavily in the first place? How do people become alcoholics? And what motivates them to keep drinking? Well, as we're about to find out, it's a combination of genetics, brain chemistry, and environment.
Scientists have been studying the mystery of alcoholism for over a century, but it's only been in the last 20 years that the trail has gotten hot. Extensive research over the last 2 decades has found a genetic link that helps to separate normal drinking habits from alcoholism. Thanks to groundbreaking genetic studies involving laboratory animals and human families, we now know that in many cases, an important genetic factor may underlie alcoholism, a fact that helps to explain why alcoholism tends to run in families. For some alcoholics, a difference in genetics causes a difference in the brain's chemical balance, making them more sensitive to the pleasurable effects of alcohol. In other words, people who have inherited a genetic predisposition for alcoholism feel more intense pleasure when they drink. So just how much more pleasurable is it? While this answer has been difficult to measure, we do know that alcoholics will continue to drink repeatedly and ignore serious health and social consequences. In other words, it appears that alcoholics get enough pleasure or relief from discomfort from their drinking that it outweighs the many problems caused by their drinking. Let's take a closer look. As humans, there are many things that give us pleasure. Whether it's a romantic vacation, a favorite meal, or a leisurely game of golf, we have an almost unlimited array of options. The pleasure we feel from these activities comes from the reward pathways that lie deep within our brain. Directly or indirectly, the reward pathways control all of our feelings of pleasure, regardless of the activity or its consequences. This is why the reward pathways are referred to as the brain's pleasure center. Besides sheer enjoyment, the reward pathways are also vital to our survival, not only as individuals, but also as a species. By making food enjoyable to eat, they keep us alive. By making sex pleasurable, they help us to have children and keep the species alive. All of these pleasurable activities stimulate the reward pathways and are referred to as positive reinforcers. Positive reinforcer is the term for things that make people and animals more likely to repeat certain behaviors so they can get what they want over and over again. Smoking is a good example. People who derive pleasure from smoking will often light up and smoke cigarettes continuously. Because the nicotine contained in cigarettes is a strong reinforcer, a person will often repeat the smoking behavior regardless of any negative health consequences. We do this because if something is positively reinforcing, it feels like we're being rewarded for our behavior, which means we will most likely do it again. Like nicotine, alcohol is also a positive reinforcer. Many people say that drinking alcohol makes them feel better, which means they find it to be a rewarding experience. Drinking alcohol is positively reinforcing when it increases feelings of pleasure, such as when people drink to celebrate. However, people do not always drink to celebrate. Sometimes drinking alcohol is reinforcing because it decreases people's sensitivity to unpleasant emotions or painful memories. Negative reinforcement is the term used to describe the things that make people and animals repeat certain behaviors to avoid an unpleasant event. Whether people drink for reasons related to positive or negative reinforcement, in both cases their lift in mood can be attributed to the same source: stimulation of their reward pathways.
Our understanding of alcohol as a positive reinforcer and its effects on the reward pathways has led to the development of the reward model of addiction. The reward model of addiction is a widely accepted explanation for how and why people become alcoholics and provides a biological basis for alcohol dependence. According to the reward model of addiction, people drink alcohol because it's rewarding. That is, they find the experience to be positively or negatively reinforcing. Although people often propose other, more complex reasons to explain their drinking, a very important reason they drink is quite simple. They drink because it makes them feel better. To explain the transition from casual drinker to problem drinker, the reinforcement model of addiction focuses on the amount of time and energy a person will spend to get and drink alcohol. A key indication that someone has become a problem drinker is that they spend more and more of their time and energy finding and drinking alcohol, even if it's at the expense of other important and rewarding activities.
As people begin to make alcohol their primary source for deriving pleasure, they start to substitute drinking for other healthier pleasurable activities like exercise, hobbies, and family activities. Drinking alcohol on a regular basis can eventually lead to the elimination of healthier reinforcing activities because intoxicated individuals are much less likely to initiate a vigorous workout or enjoy a quiet evening at home with their family. As they become dependent upon alcohol, alcoholics probably lose interest in many other reinforcers because they no longer produce as much pleasure or reward as compared to alcohol.
In addition, alcohol effectively allows alcoholics to escape from unpleasant emotions, including those caused by their drinking. As a result, they'll continue to drink repeatedly despite the negative consequences.
So what makes alcohol such a powerful reinforcer? A closer look reveals that alcohol is a chemical that very effectively stimulates the reward pathways. Therefore, it's easy to see how alcoholics can become addicted. Alcohol is a more powerful reinforcer because its impact on the reward pathways is much greater than that of most non-drug reinforcers. Also, alcohol provides a more immediate reward than natural reinforcers. For example, experiencing what is known as runner's high can take many hours of training and effort to achieve. Alcohol, on the other hand, provides a feeling of well-being in just a matter of minutes. Alcohol is also a more reliable reinforcer and is guaranteed to stimulate the reward pathways. Non-drug reinforcers, on the other hand, are more variable. For example, the pleasure we get from watching our favorite sports team may be short-lived if their opponents hand them a big loss. Finally, alcohol requires less effort than non-drug reinforcers. Alcoholics prefer the ease of opening a can or a bottle for stimulation of their reward pathways over spending hours hiking up a mountain trail. Clearly, for an alcoholic, alcohol can be an easy, quick fix or a high-speed expressway to feeling better. That is why it is often such a major challenge for recovering alcoholics to substitute healthier reinforcers for the pleasures they get from alcohol and alcohol-related activities. The difficulty of doing so may also explain why some abstinent alcoholics begin to abuse other drugs or develop other compulsive behaviors such as gambling and overeating.
While we can thank our reward pathways for all of our pleasurable experiences, unfortunately, under certain circumstances, they can backfire on us. For example, people who inherit risk for alcoholism can be led astray by their reward pathways. That is to say, they are genetically predisposed to feel enhanced levels of pleasure from drinking alcohol.
So what's happening to the reward pathways of an alcoholic that makes them respond differently to alcohol? Well, the answer begins right here in the limbic system. The limbic system contains most of the key structures associated with the reward pathways. Inside the limbic system, the reward pathways are linked to areas of the brain that control emotions, decision-making, and memory. The reward pathways link three important brain areas: the ventral tegmentum, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. What we experience as pleasure begins with stimulation of neurons in the ventral tegmentum. The stimulation then extends to the nucleus accumbens and into the prefrontal cortex. Located in the center of the reward pathways, the nucleus accumbens is a tiny area of the brain that has a big impact. Because it appears to be responsible for all of the strong feelings of pleasure created by drinking alcohol and using drugs, the nucleus accumbens is commonly referred to as the pleasure center. Research shows that stimulating the reward pathways causes the release of large amounts of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It is the release of dopamine, especially in the nucleus accumbens, that creates the feelings of pleasure we experience when we drink alcohol. Studies with laboratory animals have shown how effective stimulation of the reward pathways can be in producing addictive behavior. For example, lab mice can be trained to push a lever using alcohol as a positive reinforcer. Tests have shown that the mice will work to the point of exhaustion, continually pushing the lever to receive alcohol, because in doing so, they can stimulate the reward pathways. With people, this behavior would be termed a loss of control. Studies have shown that when alcoholics drink, more dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens than when non-alcoholics drink. This is why alcoholics experience more pleasure from drinking, and why they find alcohol more positively reinforcing than non-alcoholics do. Along with dopamine, scientists have found that alcoholics have different levels of two other important neurotransmitters: serotonin, which affects our moods, and endogenous opiates, naturally occurring morphine-like molecules that affect how we experience both pain and pleasure. These differences in neurotransmitter levels all have an important genetic component and help to create a predisposition toward alcoholism.
We've seen how the reward pathways link several very important areas of the brain. One area in particular, the nucleus accumbens, houses the brain's pleasure center. It is here, through the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, that we experience all of the pleasurable effects of alcohol. But as we're about to see, sometimes alcohol can affect the reward pathways even before we take a drink. So far, we've talked about how alcohol affects the reward pathways. Like other drugs, alcohol stimulates our reward pathways by directly causing changes in our brain chemistry. However, there are other less direct ways to stimulate the reward pathways.
Many of these indirect ways involve environmental cues, such as the people, places, and activities closely associated with the direct stimulation of the reward pathways. When the reward that results from drinking is paired over and over again with certain places, a bar for example, we are conditioned to experience the bar as a pleasurable place. Then, when our reward pathways are stimulated by an environmental cue, like entering a bar, we often experience a strong desire to drink. This strong desire is what is known as a craving. Similarly, if you tend to do most of your drinking with the same group of friends, you may begin to feel the urge to drink just from seeing them. This is because you have associated the habit of drinking with this particular group of people. This learned association is called a conditioned response.
So what are conditioned responses, and how do they turn into cravings? The answer begins with a trip to Russia.
A century ago, a renowned physiologist, Ivan Pavlov, formulated his groundbreaking theory of behavior involving learned associations and conditioned responses. Pavlov is most famous for his experiments involving dogs, where just before he would feed them, he would ring a bell. As the dogs began to associate being fed with hearing the bell, the dogs soon learned to expect food every time they heard the ringing of the bell. Soon, just hearing the bell was enough for the dogs to become excited. They would begin to salivate just as though they were actually being fed. This behavior is called a conditioned response. Just like Pavlov's dogs hearing a bell, people also learn to make connections between their environment and the positive reinforcers associated with that environment. Alcohol isn't any different. People tend to associate the pleasurable feelings of drinking with the people, places, and activities that are around when that drinking happens. The environmental features that evoke cravings for alcohol are often referred to as triggers. While some triggers to drink are external cues from the world that surrounds us, other triggers may be internal, such as painful memories or unpleasant emotions. Whether internal or external, exposure to these triggers can cause neurons within the reward pathways to release small amounts of dopamine as an anticipatory response.
Like Pavlov's dogs being triggered by a bell to salivate in anticipation of food, our brains also learn to anticipate drinking when exposed to cues associated with alcohol. Under these circumstances, our brains release small amounts of dopamine in the reward pathways. Interestingly, some human laboratory studies have shown that alcoholics respond to seeing and smelling their favorite alcoholic beverage with an increased desire to drink and often with an increase in their production of saliva. These anticipatory responses form the biological basis for the cravings that many alcoholics feel.
Related to cravings, studies with animals have led to another important finding. Researchers have found that if you give an animal a small amount of alcohol, then a short time later, allow that same animal to drink as much as it chooses, the animal will drink far more alcohol than it would have if it had not received that first little drink. This effect is called a priming effect. It's believed that the first small amounts of alcohol somehow prepare the brain to drink more. Biologically, this priming effect is explained by the first sip of alcohol causing the release of small amounts of dopamine in the reward pathways of the brain. The priming effect may explain why some recovering alcoholics drink to excess after just a sip of alcohol. Their brains may be permanently primed to drink as a result of their long drinking history.
By understanding how alcohol affects the reward pathways, we begin to learn about the complex processes involved in both the development of alcoholism and in recovery. Because alcohol can be a powerful and reliable positive reinforcer, we've learned that many recovering alcoholics have difficulty in enjoying activities that do not involve drinking. This may be why some abstinent alcoholics begin to abuse other drugs or develop other addictive behaviors. We've also learned that because environmental cues can stimulate the reward pathways and lead to cravings, recovering alcoholics should attempt to avoid the people, places, and activities that they strongly associate with their drinking. Finally, we've learned the importance of the priming effect and that even the smallest amounts of alcohol can lead a recovering alcoholic to have a serious relapse. All of these problems experienced by alcoholics have an important genetic component. And because alcoholics cannot change their genes, they are forced to live in a world that surrounds them with alcohol.